There we go. And now.
Got it. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Paul Sapuya and I'm Associate Professor here in the Department of Viz Arts at UCSD and Chair of the Speaker Series Committee along with Associate Professor Pinar Yoldas and Assistant Professor Janelle Iglesias. This speaker series is supported by the Bruton Family Foundation. I would like to thank everyone who's participated in nominating artists for this series, as well as special thanks to Nick and Laura, Yulia at Paolo, and Arlene for your help and assistance in coordinating. This week, we are thrilled to have Christina Fernandez joining us. Fernandez is a Los Angeles-based photographer, artist working in photography, among other things. Her work explores personal connections to the history of Los Angeles. The city and its environs become an important backdrop for her works that address labor, gender, migration, and her Mexican-American identity. She works across documentary formats. Her urban and landscape photography conveys social and political commentaries regarding her immediate environment. And these diverse projects have featured photographs depicting mythical and historic figures, examinations of the work and domestic life of Latino residents in Eastern Los Angeles, and the interplay of private and public spaces. And she has a long-standing engagement with her neighborhood of El Sereno and the tension between dense residential areas and the, quote, natural spaces in urban areas. She is represented by Gallery Luisotti in Santa Monica, and her work has been exhibited at MoCA, Los Angeles, LACMA, MoMA, New York, the Smithsonian. And her work is in the collections of MoCA, MoMA, LACMA, the Mexican Museum in San Francisco, Williams College Museum of Art, the Smithsonian, and the Getty Museum, among many others. And it's also really exciting to know that she is having an upcoming survey of 30 years of her practice at the UC Riverside, California Museum of Photography, along with a presentation of new work at UC Arts, opening in September of this year, and is also having an installation of new work at the Benton Museum of Art, opening simultaneously this fall. So she's got a busy calendar, so it's great that she's taking time to be with us. And she's also, on top of that, curating an exhibition, a group exhibition of younger Chicanx and Chicana artists working in photography. So thank you, Christina. Please welcome me in welcoming Christina Fernandez to our speaker series, and I'll hand off to you.
Oh, wow, that was great. I kind of don't like hearing everything I have to do in the next few months. It's going to be rough, but anyways, I'm so glad to be here. I love San Diego. It's one of my favorite places to visit. I think Paul's, description of who I am is actually pretty thorough, except that I like to add that I am a mother of a wonderful son and also an educator. I'm faculty at Cerritos College. It's a local community college in Cerritos, California. So I'm going to get started here. Let's see, where is my presentation? Share a screen, thank you. And then the presentation. Okay, so I've loaded up a lot of work here to talk about. I need to not talk about everything thoroughly, and certainly the work is not in chronological order. Most of the work that I've, all of the work that I've uploaded for this presentation is photography, although I do occasionally work in installation. So I'll begin with this piece. This is a series called View from Here. It involves, being a single mom of a very active boy. I oftentimes would take off on a road trip with him and photograph, and multiple trips later, looking through the photographs, I thought, I need to I need to make some work from these travels and these adventures that we're having. I got into off-roading and would go to lots of obscure, fun places, and decided to try to do something historical, meaning that working with the historical places that I was traveling to via my Jeep and dirt roads. So on one of these trips, I went up 395, just east of the Sierras, and I went by Manzanar internment camp. Um, this piece is called Toyo for Toyo Miyataki. He was a photographer um, at the internment camp at Manzanar. He was also an internee. He was being held there. He initially was not allowed a camera and had to build a camera by bringing in parts that he could make into a camera. And at the same time, Ansel Adams was, as part of the government's program to document America, Ansel Adams was invited to document Manzanar. And, the difference being with Toyo's documentation of Manzanar is that he couldn't leave Manzanar and Ansel could. So here I am photographing from inside a reconstructed barrack that was used to house the internees at Manzanar. And I'm giving you a sort of point of view that maybe Ansel would have taken, a photograph maybe Ansel would have taken, pointed at the snow-capped, beautiful Eastern Sierras. The view is obscured because I don't know what Toyo would have felt about this, about somebody else's ability to leave and come and go and photograph as they please, and his inability to do that. So the view is obscured because, it is not an ideal landscape, right? Through Adam's eyes, it's an ideal landscape, but through Toyo's, it is not, because he's been imprisoned along with many other people for no reason other than their Japanese heritage. So the series kind of follows in this track where I'm using an architectural framework to frame the view, not a completely novel thing in photography. But I wanted to explore these historical structures and the people that built them or lived in them, and use the view as sort of a portrait of somebody, but an incomplete portrait. So, excuse me. So I will continue with the next couple of pieces. So this is named Noah, from Noah Purafoy. It was taken at the Outdoor Museum out there in Apple Valley. I always wondered about Noah's interest in going out where nobody else lived and creating these beautiful works of art. In a sense, this place became a pilgrimage for his work and for people who were fans of his work. And to this day, even after his passing, it's a very popular place to do your Instagram photograph. But I wanted to spend some time looking through the views of the windows that were constructed by Noah and what he must have been seeing and thinking at the time that he was building these portals, right? These are not inside places. These are really spaces that are carved out with the sculptural work that he did in the middle of the desert. So I'm using, obviously, less depth of field as a stand-in for the unknown, the unknowable, really. Another artist by the name of Cabot Yerksa, who lived out in Desert Hot Springs, and at Adobe he built himself. He built about a 3-story structure that was permeated by windows, 150 something windows, to create what he called the Venturi effect. So he would open some windows and close others during the day in order to make the home as cool as possible or as warm as possible, depending on the season. So yeah, the structure has 150 windows. Another window from Cabot Yurksa. So this is on the 3rd story, whereas the previous window is on the 1st story. So you can see the change in the view as you go through the structure. And I'll just scroll through some of these. The last image I have here is called Laura A for Laura Aguilar. She's a Chicanx artist who passed, I believe, in 2019. I photographed after she passed. I happened to know the person that was taking care of her estate and asked permission to go inside her home to photograph her windows or through her windows. And this is the window that I chose. It's her view from her bedroom window. I didn't know Laura very well. I exhibited with her many, many times. And it was a pleasure to know her. And, you know, I was very sad that she passed. She's one of very few accomplished, extremely talented Chicanx photographers that actually made, you know, made something of her work and is known to the general art public. There's not very many of us. So I love this view. Somebody mentioned to me that the knot in the curtain kind of looks like some of her nudes that she did in the desert. And I kind of agree, but that wasn't completely unconscious. All right. This is a series I did of portraits of former students who I've kept in touch with. I work at a community college, and you know, that's just a 2-year foundational program. And sometimes people go rather quickly. Sometimes really talented people stick around. Sometimes they move on to the CSU or UC. And I hate when these relationships are ending because people are moving on. And so I wanted to document my students in some way. And I asked them to photograph a camera of theirs. And then I would project the image that they photographed onto them. So this is Juan. This is Alice. Joseph. So Joseph became a DJ, so I thought we should do something with lights. So that's actually a light table that he's holding in the darkroom entrance in the back of his camera, which he hadn't photographed in a while. So when he opened the back, the film just came pouring out, which I thought was really funny and makes for a really stunning projection. And Steve, who is now actually a teacher. He earned an MFA in dancing. He went to UCLA as an undergrad in the arts and then earned his MFA in dance. So as I said, this presentation is in no way chronological. That sort of bores me. So I just arranged the images as, you know, as suited me. This is a series that I did called Lavanderia. It's basically the entrances of laundromats, in which I am using a 4x5 view camera to produce a large image So these are larger in size than the previous works. And they're basically the fronts of laundromats. When I was photographing this, I at first photographed from an oblique angle, and I was trying to do something kind of Hopper-esque, I would say, but decided that those oblique angles did not work and that the fully frontal window was a better choice. And at the time that I was photographing, I didn't see the upside down window, the upside down flag in the window. I don't know if this was a mistake or if somebody was actually registering a protest on the window, right? Sign of distress. The graffiti is etching liquid that is etched onto the glass by painting onto it. It's like an acid that etches the window, and so it's fairly permanent. And this allowed me to continue to go back to the same spaces and photograph again. Setting up a 4x5 is kind of a daunting thing, and sometimes you don't always get it right. So being able to go back, because this graffiti is not removable, kind of helped the process of getting these images. So these are numbered, Lavanderia number 1, number 2, number 3. I'm sorry, this is not number 3, this is number 4. Left number 3 out. Number 5. What was interesting is I thought that when I shot Laundromats, I would get a lot of images of women and kids, and I did, but I also got a lot of images of young men or men doing their laundry, taking care of their business, right? Maybe that was a somewhat chauvinistic point of view, I don't know, but it was unexpected. Lavanderia number 6, number 8, nine, 10, and then the last one, 11. So this was taken several years after the first initial photograph was taken, and we still see the remnants of this etching or painted graffiti, which has a very different effect than spray paint, right? Because it drips, and you can it's sort of translucent, it's luminous. It very much attracted my eye when I first saw it. This is an install shot of a piece that I did about my great-grandmother. It is called Maria's Great Expedition. It was originally a piece that I did for the Mexican Museum. Chan Noriega had asked me to be part of a show that was basically a photography show of Chicana narrative photography, and it was called From the West. So this is the piece that I made for that show. This is actually an install shot at the Getty a few years ago. It was part of a show called Reenactment at the Getty. So it takes on a sort of natural history display, basically showing my great-grandmother's life as she traveled throughout the Southwest and migrated up from Uruapan, Michoacan, and at last settled in San Diego, California, San Diego. So a view of the map. It is a composite map that was made from historical maps. So it was literally like Xeroxed and, pasted and drawn on and then scanned. So it's a digital image now. But as you can see, there's all these sort of, Spanish explorers, if you will, Cordova, Cabrillo, Ulloa, and then Maria. So this is an image of her in which I am enacting her story. So we had very few photographs of my great-grandmother. So there was no way to put together a narrative of her life using found photograph or existing family photographs. So I decided that I needed to reenact her life. And so that is what I did. I had something like a $1,500 budget, so pretty hard to reenact something that is, time-based and is supposed to take place during a certain time and location. So I, in some of these photographs, had to acknowledge that this is a reenactment. And I realized during the creation of the photographs that that was something probably that was a good thing. Because it sort of points towards the present, right? And that there are people currently going through this immigration process, right? Coming up from Mexico. So it, in the end, made sense not to have these perfect reenactments. So this is 1914, leaving Morelia, Michoacan. 1919, Portland, Colorado, which she worked as a laundress for miners. She was actually jailed during this time of prohibition, where she ran a still and was put in jail while my grandfather and his siblings were to fend on their own as children. So some of the injustice that happened to women at that time, and still, of course, happen now, but there was no support system whatsoever. So my grandfather was, at the tender young age of like 5 or 6 years old, he was, left to fend for himself while his mother was in jail for several weeks, from what he can remember. So again, 1919, Portland, Colorado. 1927, going back to Mexico. So her brothers came and found her and told her her mother was dying, and she decided to go back. But in order to signal to them that she had changed and she was independent, she cut her hair really short and wore lipstick. And this was her signal that she wasn't there to stay. She was there to visit only, and she was going back to the US. She became a sharecropper, so she would actually rent out land to people who would grow vegetables, and she would pack up or get a portion of these and pack up, and she bought herself a car, and she would go to market and sell. So she was very entrepreneurial in her own way. So, as I mentioned before, these reenactments could not be perfect. So obviously this is, this is a shot that's supposed to take place in 1930, right? It's meant to look like a Dorothea Lange photograph, but there's a modern truck there. So here, I'm sort of acknowledging that this is a reenactment. Aliso Village, 1945. So my grandfather got a job ship welding, and Maria went to go live with him. And here she is in front of Aliso Village. These buildings no longer exist. It became housing projects, but at the time it was housing for the war effort, basically, and people who were working in the shipyards. And the last image, 1950, San Diego. She eventually settled here with one of her other sons, and died shortly after in 1952. So again, the anachronism that's added to acknowledge this idea of a reenactment is the 99-cent store flyer. And a little known fact, I'm in the kitchen of the wonderful Chicana painter Patsy Valdez in this shot. She lent me her kitchen. I thought it was a perfect turquoise color to represent the 1950s. So I began to travel to Mexico to photograph the ruins in Oaxaca, particularly the Zapotec ruins. I was very interested in their belief system, interested in Oaxaca. But I had unusual experiences there that I think a lot of Mexican Americans that travel to this part of the world have, which is, you see basically Indigenous women and children not treated very well. They're in poverty a lot of times. And yet, as a Chicana being raised by Chicano activists, I was always taught that, the Indigenous were to be respected. They were the foundation of our culture, and to experience what I could only characterize as racism towards Indigenous people in Mexico was shocking. I know that sounds naive, but it was. I came back and tried to grapple with these things, and it was not an easy thing to grapple with. I knew Mexico through the faces of Indigenous women because of the photography of Mexico, right? Mostly by Mexican photographers. And I wanted to speak to how I felt an affinity towards Indigenous women, but also speak about how I was so different and separated through geography, through the generations of time that my family has been here in the US. So I started photographing up close images of Indigenous women by photographers. This happens to be taken from an image of a film still of the great cinematographer, Emilio Figueroa. I noticed that you could see the halftone. So there was this acknowledgement that I was knowing these women or interacting with these faces that were reproduced in books and not for real, right? So I thought that that lent to the complexity of what I was trying to say with the series. So I would photograph the images in the book, make little thumbnails, and then photograph myself in the studio, somehow interacting or striking a pose that was similar to the woman in the photograph. And so created this interplay between us, me in the studio, them in the photo book, but visually close, but not really close. I took this from Manuel Alvarez Bravo. It's called Girl Watching Birds. It's actually a horizontal shot. So I made a point to photograph these as portraits, portraits of the women, rather than women in these larger settings. Different photographer this time, Nacho Lopez, very well-known Mexico City photojournalist. And again, in this one, you could really, really see the halftone marks. I'm hoping you're able to see that on your screen. Manuel Alvarez Bravo. Again, this is a horizontal shot taken in a cemetery. This young woman in a rebozo. I am sort of hugging her and hugging myself at the same time. She is lit from the left-hand side and I am lit from the right. it creates this layering, this complexity of image that I really thought fit the complex feelings and experiences that I had in Oaxaca. Another image by Figueroa in which I've superimposed myself. Lopez. Another image by Bravo. And the only Medoti image. I find it rather hard to work with Medoti's photography because she photographed women in a very different way, almost sculptural way, and grappled for a while trying to figure out how I was going to use Medoti's images of Indigenous women. But I finally came up with a solution. So a different series of work. This one's entitled Manuela S-t-i-t-c-h-e-d. So this is the text part of it. Oftentimes my work has text or a text accompaniment of some sort. I didn't really focus that on that with Maria's Great Expedition, but if you recall the installation shot, there's a shelf of basically 6 pages of text that go with each photograph. I forgot to mention that. This text is on the wall, it is framed, and this is basically a machine stitched embroidery with black thread on muslin. So it's not written text, it's embroidered text on muslin. Muslin is basically like a throwaway fabric that pattern makers use in the garment industry to drape a garment and then make a pattern from. I'll just read, well, you guys can read this, but I'll read it for you. Looking down, she saw that her stocking had a run. La Migra came like a storm today. The end of a black thread was caught on her heel. It trailed away, winding around the corner. She pictured an empty spool and feared they would notice it and find her. So I'm creating this narrative, obviously not really based in reality, right? It's sort of like a paranoid dream. But I wanted to transmit the feeling of being panicked like that, fearing for, somebody catching you or being deported. I interviewed several women who had worked in the fashion industry, one of which had experienced an immigration raid. And I didn't want to exploit her story or tell her story verbatim because it's too long, but I wanted to sort of condense a sort of fantastic narrative that would give that feeling of paranoia. So this woman is running away from the migra and looks down. She sees that a thread has gotten caught in her heel, and she's thinking in her mind, oh my God, they're gonna follow it and find me. This is accompanied by very sort of banal, almost new topographic images of garment factories. And they're very, sort of Los Angeles, right, in their banality and mixed use as well. So these are printed rather large. And when you see them live, you can see that in the windows are always all covered for whatever reason. I guess they don't want people seeing inside. But also there is signage that asks for, somebody that can run a cover stitch machine or an overstitch machine, or somebody that can use the steam iron. They have these very large steam irons that are, difficult to use. It requires skilled labor for sure. And in these, I felt like these signs created almost like a body of workers. And were stand-ins for those bodies, much like the window views of view from here, the first series I showed you. So this is Leo fashion, San Pedro fashion. It's on San Pedro Street. Yilek fashion. And again, you could see the sign there. Looking for an overstitch operator. Cover stitch, but not in English or Spanish. And I don't know, I think that's Chinese. This is one of the mixed use buildings in LA. They have a lot of buildings that are mixed use where people live but also work. Fashion International. Starline Fashion. TT&T. One time I was presenting this work and Betty Avila from Self-Help Graphics said, my mother used to work there. So that was a weird coincidence. If you haven't been to Self-Help Graphics, you should go for sure. Napa Apparel. Right, well, completely different. Install shot of a piece that I revived from the past back in 2020, just after we were able to go to galleries and museums. Installed this at Gallery Luisati. It is called Bend. It is yet another piece that came out of my travels to Oaxaca. So as you can see, there are photographs of the Oaxacan, Zapotec ruins from Oaxaca in the back, from Dayanzu, from Monte Alban, Cerro de la Campaña, different ruin sites across Oaxaca. It has 2 pieces of text on either side that basically relay a travel narrative of my experiences in Oaxaca, and at the same time, the death of my grandmother. So being in Oaxaca while my grandmother was passing and did eventually pass, and I had to return to the US. And that's a self-portrait of my back in the middle. So this is the text. I won't go through all the text, but I'm talking about photographing with my backpack full of camera equipment, and how in order to photograph a little urn of the god Cosijo, I have to sort of balance myself on some steps, and the guide to the structure basically takes this big piece of sheet metal and reflects the sunlight into the tomb in order for me to photograph, which I thought was this sort of astounding and wonderful thing that happened during my travels there. Let me go back to the, this is Monte Alban. So Cosijo is the god of lightning, and you get these incredibly beautiful skies in Oaxaca. Dayanzu. Self-portrait. The self-portrait is here because I'm talking about my back a lot in the narrative, and also talking about seeing the skeletal remains of a Zapotec woman in the Monte Alban Museum, where she's, laid out perfectly in her, with her pots next to her. And I'm sort of looking down at this skeleton that's displayed in the floor of the museum. and thinking about my grandmother and how she's ill and I'm going to need to travel back to Orange County to try to deal with my grandmother passing. So it's sort of a loose skeleton that I've painted on my back, and which I'm sort of grasping at and making a mess of. Dianzu steps. And Mitla. And the other side of the text where I talk about seeing this woman this woman's skeleton in this narrow cubicle, leaving the museum, and a burst of sun and heat engulfed me. And I think of my grandmother in an Orange County hospital, her small body hooked up to a respirator, her breath becoming more labored and difficult as the days passed. So I often use text in a very personal way, as with Maria's Great Expedition. So this piece is called Untitled Farm Workers, is basically my brother's hand inserting an index card into soil to create a sort of landscape effect. It's 5x7, 54 5x7 cards, or photographs, I should say, that have 3x5 index cards talking about or documenting the deaths of farm workers due to pesticide. So this is a close-up. So Gloria Zuniga died as a result of denied medical treatment and exposure to Zolan. And Dolores Huerta suffered a ruptured spleen, broken ribs, and other injuries due to a police beating. So I am reinstalling this piece at the Benton Museum of Art in Pomona. I have this canvas piece that is somewhat large. It's like 63 by 33 inches, something like that. And I'm going to, put a bunch of dirt in the museum and plant index cards of more recent deaths of farm workers in the fields due to heat stroke. So because of global warming and our increased temperatures, oftentimes when people need to pick the food that we eat, and some of these are not young people, right? People in their 60s working in the fields. Pesticide is still an issue, but more so now, heat stroke due to increased temperatures of global warming. So the grid piece will accompany a new installation of dirt and cards this fall. So I hope you all will visit the Benton Museum. So more recent work is sort of utilizing the compositing aspect of photo editing software. So this is called American Trailer. There's kind of a long story about this. I think we have time, sort of. I won't go too long on it, but as I mentioned, I'm a mother of a wonderfully active son, and when he was young, he would go motorcycle racing. He liked dirt bikes, and I would take him way out to a dirt bike track in Riverside, and we would have a full day of activity, and then we would put the bike on the trailer and head out. And I remember heading out, and the road that heads out kind of T-zones this wonderful sort of salvage yard. So there was all these old cars and old trailers as you can see in the background, it looks like there's a Chevelle back there. There's definitely a Volkswagen Beetle on the other side of the image, a couple of trailers and van trailers. It's basically a boneyard for older vehicles or vintage vehicles. And when I first went to photograph, well, when I first encountered this camper, I noticed it because the sun was shining through the window. It was quite beautiful. And I thought, I need to come back to photograph that. So I did. So the next, dirt bike day trip, I brought my camera and I photographed it. Took the photographs home and I wasn't entirely happy with it. So I knew I would have to go back. And it was this beautiful vintage trailer. So I went back another time to photograph it, but this time I photographed it in pieces. So almost like a grid, right? In order to capture some of the details up close. I didn't quite finish. It was a very long trailer, so I knew I'd have to go back again for the third time. And then the third time I went back, whoever must have been living in there, or at the very least partying in this trailer, unfortunately had a fire. And the fire was completely destroyed, almost completely destroyed the trailer. Now, the trailer for me has all these incredible sort of meanings attached to it, like this idea of adventure, of taking home with you, the open road, communing with nature, but still having the comforts of home. But of course, the trailer has taken on a completely new and tragic meaning, right? Where it's basically people are using trailers to mitigate homelessness or houselessness. So they're living in these old trailers, right? They're parking them on the sides of the road and trying not to get booted off. And this is their home, not something that they necessarily, have adventures across the country with. So there's all this complexity when it comes to the American trailer in terms of what they mean to different people. And I really wanted to sort of say something about that. And so I combined basically the photographs of the beautiful vintage trailer that it once was with the photographs of the burnt and disintegrating, destroyed trailer. And it kind of moves from left to right, basically. So on the left-hand side, you see the first initial photographs that I took of this beautiful sunlight, sort of, late afternoon, golden light that is sort of caressing the front of the trailer, which was old but beautiful. And then as you progress to the right-hand side, it is fire destroyed and falling apart. And I'll show some detailed shots of that. In some of the areas of the piece, you can see the compositing, which was intentional. So the entire piece is sort of made out of a patchwork of images. I think there's like 70 something photographs on this image. A lot of photographs. Okay, and it looks like I'm gonna be wrapping this up with this image. It's called Burn Area 1. Not a totally novel title. So what I'm doing here is I'm following with that idea of compositing and returning to a space multiple times to photograph. So as you know, we have forest fires all the time in SoCal and in Northern California. And some of these places are a little bit hard to access. So one of the reasons I have a Jeep, so I can, make it to on the dirt roads that sometimes I have to go on to photograph these places. And I'm photographing and then returning and photographing again, maybe even a third time, definitely 2 times. And I am compositing the views of the burnt trees on top of each other. So it's, you can take a photograph of a burn area and be done with it and, walk away, but it's usually just 1 or 2 trees and they're charred and it actually kind of looks pretty or beautiful. It's picturesque anyways. And I didn't want to do that. I wanted to make these images a little uncanny, maybe a little spooky almost. And I think it's working. So this is kind of currently what I'm working on right now. So these are composited burnt trees onto a landscape scene that was also burnt down in a forest fire. And as you can see, some of them are off scale or slightly skewed in a direction that doesn't seem normal. I want it to give you sort of this, for lack of a better word, icky feeling, which I think it does. So working with compositing a lot lately. So that's one of the projects I'm working on. And then this last summer, I did a residency at UCross in Wyoming and was photographing battlefields there. This is the battlefield of 100 in the Hands, or previously referred to as a Fetterman battlefield. 100 in the Hands is where Arapaho, Sioux, and Cheyenne warriors collaborated together to defeat the cavalry, and they won. And so I went to a number of these battlefields, including the Battle of Little Bighorn in Montana as well. So I'm not sure what I'm doing with these quite yet, but they're landscape spaces that are incredibly meaningful to me and to others, I'm sure. And I'm not sure quite how to convey that yet. So these are all works in progress. I may have to go back to Wyoming, I'm not sure. And this is a view of Heart Mountain from Heart Mountain Relocation Center in Wyoming. So again, I'm obscuring the background. I'm making it blurry through depth of field effects and focusing on the barbed wire. And, the idea that people were kept here within this beautiful landscape. And that is it.
Okay. That was wonderful. Thank you so much.
I hope I didn't put anybody asleep.
No,
I have this kind of monotone voice when I speak.
No, it's always so wonderful to get such a great overview of your practice. I've enjoyed being able to catch some of your work in person, but being able to see all of this is just so great for all of us. So just for everyone out there watching us, we are switching to Q&A for the next little bit. So feel free to drop your questions into the YouTube stream, and we will be, we're gonna have those sent over to us in Zoom and try to sort of respond to them. And so while we're waiting for a few questions to come in, Christina, could I just sort of like ask you one thing to start out? It's, your practice has really embraced so many kinds of photography and so many kinds of ways of working with both history, documentary, but also, like you said, embracing anachronism, reenactment, and then it's also in these new images of compositions, it's really kind of pulling away from an idea of photography's indebtedness to a moment in time.
Right.
So, like, how do you, just how do you think about time overall in photography? Um, and maybe I'm curious just to know, what was your first introduction to photography?
Well, okay. Multiple moments of time, right? I mean, that's the thing about photography is that, we think of it as capturing that one, 60th of a second moment in time, but really, what I'm interested in is sort of, what about time and space? What about, so how can photography represent that in some way? And I've come up with different solutions over the different projects, right? With Maria's Great Expedition, it was reenactment. With the Untitled Multiple Exposures, it's actually layering of image, right? Historical image and present image or contemporary image. So in a way, I think that's the beginning of that compositing impulse but now I'm compositing in a different way, right? I'm using software to do it instead of the film of the camera to do it. So my introduction to photography was actually through, there's been stages. So initially, my father gave me an A1 when I was 6. Like, I do not know how he thought I could handle that. So yeah, he gave me a Canon A1 when I was 6 years old. And of course, the photographs came out unfocused, not very well exposed. But my dad was a hobbyist photographer, and he loved to collect cameras. And he photographed everything. I mean, he photographed from family events to our times on the picket line, at rallies, meetings, whatever. So he was, sort of a documentary photographer. He liked to record the moments of his life through photography. And then after that, I went to UCLA as an undergrad, and I was basically a printmaker, painter, and I'd asked my counselor to get out of the photography class. I didn't think it would be interesting to me, and the counselor said, nope, you can't skip photography. You have to take photography. So I took it, and I happened to get a visiting teacher, Robert Heineken's wife, actually, Joyny Manis, was my teacher. And I don't know if anybody out there knows her work or knows her. She's an incredible educator, really incredible educator. So from then on, I took another class with Sheila Brooke, who eventually went to CalArts. And then I eventually went to CalArts and studied with Alan Sekula. So that's all she wrote. I was a photographer at that point.
Yeah, that's interesting. And, when you're introducing your that introduction to photography through your childhood, and these sort of the ways in which we work in media, or we sort of like understand our relationship to technology, I kind of want to use this as a way to get to what our first question. So, you brought up in making that work in Oaxaca and places, for example, what it means to return, what it means to connect with this ancestry, and oftentimes be confronted with a jarring, and suddenly it's thrown into focus, the problematic histories of representation in these media, right? So Patricia Fisher asks, how do you create this work without feeling as if you're exploiting others and perhaps the sadness in lives at times? Because you are very respectful, but she wonders if those feelings do arise.
Oh yes, those are things that, with photography especially, you always have to kind of contend with. And you have to come to a place in the creation of your work where you're comfortable with whatever it is that you're, using for your work, right?
Mhm.
I mean, as I mentioned, when I was interviewing the women who had had an experience with an immigration raid, I didn't want to use that horrific moment in her life like verbatim. I had to, although the feeling was something I wanted to convey, So I needed to come up with some type of crazy narrative that would convey that same feeling. So those are the ways I kind of mitigate, yeah, those feelings of possibly exploiting something. It's the last thing I want to do. You know, but I mean, with photography, you do run the risk all the time of doing that because it's really a collaboration with the world. So yeah, and even like with the farm worker deaths, how do you contend with making this an art piece out of somebody's passing from such tragic experience, like a pesticide poisoning? It's incredibly painful. But how else are we going to know these stories? I guess is what I always ask myself, right?
Yeah. And it runs.
I look at, I look at the work as sort of, especially in a museum space, right? Where we don't control who comes and goes and views our work. As sort of occupying a space. I know that's not really novel, but I've really always thought of my work as occupying a space. And I have a responsibility, I feel, as an artist, to sort of create an awareness. I know that not all artists feel that, but I do.
Yeah, it's so important.
Yeah.
And I just want to relay a note from our chair, Ricardo Dominguez, who says, "Thank you for your presentation of your deeply considered visual gestures."
Oh, cool.
Yeah, and one of those gestures I feel like is particularly in relation to others, placing yourself in relation, I think, as a way of being responsible to those obligations. And it's interesting that in some, in making the work around these women who had been who had experienced the violence of these immigration raids, and the farm workers who are laboring, in these extreme conditions, or being attacked for standing up for their rights, that those are some of the moments where you step outside of representational photography and have to move to another strategy. Photography, oftentimes we expect it to be there in those most at stake moments, but what it means to sort of step outside of that. So I find that just incredibly fascinating, but you're still conjuring these images. Like, are you thinking about that in terms of care, or what kinds of images are not, like, at the times in which you choose not to present a photograph?
Well, yeah. I mean, it goes back to the first question, right? With like, how do you manage this without, I don't believe, okay, I'll just say this. I don't believe that documentary photography of anybody that's been exploited or has had something tragic happen to them. I don't believe that it's inherently exploitative. I think we need those types of photographs at times. We need them to raise awareness, to bring the news to the world, right? I'm not against it at all. I just don't think I'm that type of photographer. That I don't do that. I come from a completely different point of view with my work. I think that there's a lot of good people doing that type of work. I don't think that I would be that good at it, to be honest. I like working this way, in which I'm bringing something personal and tragic and political to light, but I'm not having to contend with the idea necessarily of exploiting somebody's image, right? And their identity and their personal space, So, yeah.
Yeah. Could I ask about how you either plan and conduct research around these projects? What strategies you use in terms of investigating larger political histories, down to your own family's history.
I read, I interview, I talk to people. Some of these pieces are years in the making, right? Because I'm like doing the groundwork. I'm doing my due diligence. And yeah, some of the pieces require a lot of research. So I go to the source, like for the United Farmworkers Foundation. They have been keeping track of pesticide deaths and deaths by heat stroke forever, since their existence. So they're a resource for that type of information. For Maria's Great Expedition, I read a lot of books about women in the West, Vicky Ruiz in particular. So yeah, a lot of it involves research, whether it's interviewing people, talking to people, or reading, or whatever it may be, and can take a year or two before, I'm actually photographing. So.
Yeah, that's great. And exciting to just thank you also for sharing this newest work with
yeah, us. I don't know what I'm doing yet. I'll just let you know. But I like putting it out there because it gives people an idea of where I'm headed. It's not written in stone. I've always been interested in this idea of layering image and about time and space and photography, and trying to represent something in a way that's, more than a shutter click, right? It's multiple, and we'll see what happens.
Yeah. And maybe as a sort of final question, thinking about just career, like being the importance of being an educator, being a mother, and being an artist, how you have worked, balancing your practice, your career in education, and family. I love that this recent project grows out of those trips.
Yeah, I mean, well, it's not always easy. It's sometimes very difficult to balance all those things, especially the motherhood part of it. If it was just being an educator and an artist, it would be a little, it's doable. Because I think being an educator helps you with your art, whether it's in a physical way or, gets you to think about your own work when you're teaching students, or, or even providing resources for your work, right? But the mother addition of the mother part of it. So I had to make it work, right? I mean, a lot of images, especially recently, the last 5 years, have been more about activities that my son and I do together, and which I am finding something to photograph. I may not initially know what I'm doing, but I find something that's interesting in the landscape. And I'm glad that he's not this kid that is on his Xbox all the time, that he loves adventure. And he's very, like an outdoor kid that likes to be, going places all the time. So it's like it's coming together of different forces in your life that you make work somehow. I think that in the past, being a mother and being an artist has not been talked about that much. And I'm really grateful that things have changed, in which, women artists feel free about how motherhood impacts their production, impacts the subject matter of their work, their ability to do their work, right? Because I basically took 10 years off. That's a long time for an artist, but I had to, especially when he was young. I had to. So, coming back and from that 10-year, hiatus or whatever, you know, I got rewarded with, you know, people still being interested in the work.
Mhm.
You know, I in my wildest dreams, I would have never thought that. So it's been a good comeback. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a testament to just like the depth of your projects and the work that becomes meaningful across, that's so urgent right now, that
Right.
really needs to be seen, and just what it means to observe, and to just be aware of the world, that's kind of in front of us. There's so much there.
Oh, I thank you for that compliment. That's wonderful. Thank you.
Oh, of course, you're welcome. And there's, Karen says that it's great to hear the process for your work. And Ariel says, being a parent is hard. So thank you for acknowledging that and bringing visibility to that fact.
Yes, it is. And then put artist on top of that, right?
Yes.
Educator on top of that.
Yeah. And the process of slowing down, I think oftentimes in, you know, in our studios or in our jobs, or especially speaking to our students out there, we feel like there's these artificial timelines that things should need to be kind of like right now, right now, right now, but it really is a longer term engagement, and to have that time off can be meaningful.
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. So I think we have, just thanks for sharing your work. I don't think we have any other questions right now. So I just want to say overall a final thank you so much for your
Thank you.
generosity and time, and for the studio visits that you have upcoming.
Yes, I'm excited to do some work.
It'll be so wonderful. Let's see. Oh, actually, we have one last question. It came through at text. Can you speak a bit in general about how your work has been received by institutions and the public earlier in your career and then now? Has anything changed?
Well, yeah, I mean, recently, I think, well, let's just say that a lot of really great people did a lot of groundwork in making change happen. And I am eternally grateful for those people who, sat in lobbies of museums and protested board members and the lack of representation in collections and exhibitions,
Mhm.
So yeah, things have changed for sure for me. It's interesting having a career as a photographer. We deal in mostly 2D images that are additioned or replicated, and it's very different from being a painter or an installation artist where we're talking one of a kind things. And so even just getting over that hurdle, right, in terms of finding resources for your work that is produced from sales of the previous work is challenging. But certainly things have opened up in the museum world, I think, and even in the private collectors world. I think people finally looked at their walls and their databases and went, wait a minute, I have no people of color on this wall here. I don't have any work by a woman in my collection, or much less a woman of color. So, I mean, whatever happened, whatever movement, revolution that happened to get people to start thinking about that was incredibly necessary. But I think also that, there are younger curators who are rising through the ranks of color, and a lot of women who are changing things permanently, meaning permanent collection wise, right? Because they're acquiring works by people of color and women. So yes, I mean, I would say the first 10, 15, even 20 years is really difficult. Almost no museum collections, almost no private collections, just kind of the work sitting there in the pull-out drawer, right? In the print drawer.
Yeah.
And I would say that that has really, really changed. That's basically all I'm doing right now is filling print sales, and not just for, you know, private collectors, but for museums as well. So I'll be probably by next year be in the collection of every major institution that you could think of in the US.
That's wonderful. And also to making sure that these are comprehensive, that they're representative and not just, you know, the a single iconic work, that they can really build a conversation around.
No,
Yeah.
I mean, the museums are taking whole series, not just one or two pieces.
Yeah, that's so wonderful.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of the work can't be picked apart like that anyways, but it just wouldn't work as a singular piece. But yeah.
Yeah. So
that's good.
Yeah.
Good for me. I want it to be good for others. So this is something that we talk about. You know, I got a Latinx fellowship that was awarded this last summer. 15 cohorts were given the award. It's really great people. And these are the kinds of conversations that we have. Like, we realize there's change now, but is the change permanent? And how do we pass on the change? Like, it's good for us, but how do we continue that change for the students that are graduate students right now of color?
Yeah.
How do we continue this awareness? And so those are things that are topics of discussion in our forums. So we're thinking about it, you know. Hopefully things will be better for, you know, the next generations. I think in a way they already are, but, you know, it was hard. It's been hard, but it's definitely a reward at the end.
That's wonderful. And it's going to be so great that through these institutions, so many more people will be able to see your work, and it
yes,
really
that's true. That's true too, because you know, any show that's curated from the permanent collection of a certain museum, they'll have the choice to, you know, pick one of my works, which is incredible.
Yeah, and I think, like, you know, that brings me back to some of the first images you showed, the view from Manzanar, and thinking about your being on this site and in conversation with Toyo Miyataki, who's at a moment interned, and how fugitive it was to even make an image, and then thinking about that in relation to Ansel Adams and this ability to sort of move and come and go with, you know, a type of freedom that doesn't even kind of consider its own privilege. And so, you know, I had I have a friend, Tommy Ka, who's a Chinese American artist who grew up in the South and made a lot of landscape photographs of the South, and ran into pushback saying, oh, it's already been done. Don't you know about so-and-so and so-and-so? And it's like, well, you know, I think this is one of those problems that, like, art overall, but also photography has had, that once the image has been made, one sort of lays claim to it. And it's just part of the history of the colonizing act of photography. And so to be able to insist that you know, that initial image that lays claim does not have that authority, that you can then bring in Miyataki in conversation and say, you know, what we had known is not what we need to hold on to going forward. So yeah, it's just so wonderful to think about how your work does that. So
thank you.
Yeah,
that is I mean, what you just said is something I hadn't really thought about, that the piece is simultaneously about Adams, Toyo, and myself. I had not really thought about that.
Things are cut. That's the wonder of being an artist. The work reveals surprises to you all the time. Okay, well, I guess since we don't have any more questions, we'll just wrap this up and just say again, thank you so much.
Thank you. Lovely meeting you via Zoom.
Yes, I hope we get to meet in person.
Definitely.
Okay, take care. And thank you everyone for having joined us.
Thank you.